As a person who's been too online since I was 12 years old, one of the more fascinating subjects of videos I've come across is the exploration and analysis of cults. For a while there, it seemed like the United States just had so many cults, particularly around the 1980s. You may be familiar with a lot of them too. The Branch Davidians, Waco, Texas, Heaven's Gate in their love of Nike shoes, Zen Master Rama, and many, many more. I've talked about cults in a couple videos now. I've spoken with cult members and ex-cult members, and I've been to cult-related business fronts. It's quite the strange thing. The cult boom of the 1980s was largely affiliated with the New Age movement. People were more open to increasingly more bizarre spiritual movements headed by charismatic leaders who demanded absolute dedication to the faith. And in all honesty, this is just sort of how cults go. They don't even have to be from the New Age movement. A lot of cults, in fact, are just derived from popular religions, particularly Christianity. Waco was a Christian cult. The Jonestown event was a Christian cult. The Yellow Deli is a Christian cult. The Fat Loss cult is a Christian cult. You get the picture. Now, the other day I was thinking about these cults and what I've learned about, and I realized something that pretty much all of them are American in origin. So that led me to a question about cults abroad, and in particular about cults in our neighboring countries of Latin America. So I asked some friends, shout out my buddy Francis, and did some research into some of the most bizarre cults of Latin America. And that is what I will be sharing with you today. Also, I'd like to preface that my pronunciation of these words, these Spanish words and Portuguese words, will be bad because I failed Spanish in high school, so whatever. Luz del Mundo was founded in Mexico during the year 1926 by Aaron Joaquin Gonzalez. 1926 was quite the year to be founding a church in Mexico, actually, because the country was going through a conflict that we know today as the Cristero War, a conflict caused by the current leadership of the country actively trying to limit the power and popularity of Catholicism throughout the nation, making the practice outlawed for a bit, and its followers were relatively persecuted by the government. This led to many religious organizations practicing in secret, including La Luz del Mundo. Gonzalez, whose original name was Eusebio, claimed to have received a divine message from God himself, that message being to restore the primitive Christian church and change his name to Joaquin. After this experience, firstly, he changed his name, but secondly, he went on to form his new church in secret with his at-the-time wife. Unlike modern forms of Christianity, La Luz del Mundo is what is referred to as restorationist form of Christianity. This subsect believes that modern forms of Christian worship is inherently flawed, and the original and proper way to worship had been lost many, many years ago. Some notable differences you'll find with the church is its lack of imagery. They don't use depictions of saints or Jesus or even crosses within their worship, but more importantly is the rejection of the Holy Trinity. Within Christian doctrine, there is the idea of God being the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. They are not necessarily different beings, but rather they are all simultaneously the Abrahamic God, just in different forms. In 1936, the church would establish its first physical location in Mexico and has since expanded across the nation, reaching over 1 million members domestically. At its surface, the Luz del Mundo appears to be a normally functioning branch of Christianity, but that is only the surface. I'd like to pause here and explain some terminology I stumbled upon when researching cults. When people think of a cult, or at least I tend to think of a somewhat smaller group like Heaven's Gate or something. Other people think of like Scientology or Mormonism as cults. Now, the latter are a bit more difficult to label as such due to the massive amounts of followers, and they're generally recognized as religious institutions by the states that they reside in. Now, both of them certainly have a lot of cult-like characteristics, but since there's no academic recognition of what is a cult, many of the academic researchers that study these things, instead of using the word cult, refer to them as a high-demand religious group. So, yeah, just want to put that out there. I thought that was interesting. Now, these researchers have a few standards they apply to religions that are cult-like high-demand groups. Those being extreme authority centered around one leader, claims the leader has some sort of unique divine authority, pressure to conform and obey to leadership, social isolation, and from critics and former members, and control over members' personal lives. Now, seeing that Luz del Mundo is a very large recognized religion that is technically not labeled as a cult, but it meets the criteria above, earning it the cult-like high-demand group label. Aaron Joaquin, as mentioned prior, had absolute authority over the church, seeing that he claimed to be a living apostle that had been chosen by God to restore the Christian faith of old. Now, obviously, he's not alive or still in charge, but since his passing, both his son and grandson have upheld the mantle of living apostle by the church. And this totally isn't due to their bloodline either. It's totally 100% God who assigned each successive member of the family to be the leader of the group that their grandfather founded. All members of the church are told that the living apostle's authority comes directly from God, which creates a level of worship and control to them directly. Within the church, questioning their decisions can basically be seen as questioning the authority of God's will, which leads to loyalty to the church and the living apostle being more important than any sort of independent judgment. Very cult-like. Former members have told their stories about leaving, how it strained relationships with members of their families who were still part of the church, and they were dismissed as heretics and persecutors by their former friends. There's also some interesting dress codes involved for the members. The men are required to always keep their hair short, while the women, on the other hand, have to keep their hair long, wear ankle-length skirts, hair coverings during worship, and are heavily discouraged from wearing any sort of makeup or jewelry. Failure to adhere to any of these will result in social punishments. Within the church, there is a hierarchy structure. At first, it's similar to a standard church. The apostle is a sort of pope, the deacons and preachers are up next, and then there is the overseers of the general population. The rest of the church's followers are generally referred to as obreros or laborers, and they are the lowest member of this hierarchy. Now, laboring for what, you may ask? For God, of course. Not really, but Luz del Mundo has some pretty heavy allegations of human trafficking and forced labor amongst its members. The overseers, as I mentioned earlier, are in charge of the general population of the church, and I mean they are in charge of them. They control many of their finances. They have to approve vacations for their members, and they have to hand out permits for those wanting or needing to work outside of the church district. Oh yeah, and there's that. The church districts generally have a multitude of different shops that are staffed by free labor from its members, but they don't mind since this is God's will. Those who work for a paycheck are required to give a minimum of 10% of their earnings to the church, which uses it to buy out real estate around the established temples to create isolated micro-communities within the cities, i.e. the church district. In recent news, the current apostle of the leader of the church, Aaron Joaquin, was convicted in 2022 of sexual abuse towards minors that were all members of the congregation. Several attempts at expanding deeper in the U.S. have also faced extreme pushback in places like Georgia. So, by our metrics before, this one seems to be pretty culty, eh? Wow, today's sponsor is me again. Wow, great piece of sponsor. I have a few big-ass bumper stickers left. If you'd like that design and want it just for your water bottle or something, fear not. I have the same design in a smaller 1x2 size listed now just for you. Also, if you'd like more content from me, I post additional content on Patreon. The content I post there are topics I can't make full-length video essays on, but are still worth talking about. So if you sign up, you get to be put in the credits of the videos, and you get free stickers whenever I drop new ones. Yeah, that's it. Bye-bye. Jose Luis de Jesus Miranda was born in Ponce, Puerto Rico in 1946. He claimed to have a very troubled youth, stints in jail for stealing, and was addicted to heroin by the age of 14. But it would be God's will that saved him. He would start to work for the church, and in 1973 he became an ordained minister. In the same year, he would have a vision of two angels visiting him, which he later stated in an interview, "The same spirit that was in Jesus of Nazareth came to me in those angels, and that same spirit is in me. He came to me. He integrated with my person in 1973. Here we go. Not long after he started preaching his own ideals and teachings. A few years later, he and his wife and 5 children moved to South Florida in the Miami region. It would be there that Jose Luis would start preaching on a 15-minute AM radio time slot. And well, honestly, 15 minutes a day was all he needed to amass a small following. By 1988, Jose Luis had opened his own church called Ministerio Creciendo and Gracia. And yeah, again, sorry for butchering the Spanish words. Anyways, that translates to growing in grace. At first, Jose Luis preached the four Gospels, the basic story of Christ that you'd find in any other church. But in 1998, he got bored of that. And he also got bored of just being Jose Luis Jesus Miranda. And he claimed that he was actually the reincarnation of Paul the Apostle. So he shifted his teachings over to Paul's Gospel, which is an interesting piece of Christian literature that is often referred to as complementary and is not explicitly worshipped by many churches. Now, I'd also like to pause here. Yes, the church was founded in Florida, but Jose Luis, aka Paul the Apostle, said a majority of his following was in Latin America, so that's why I'm talking about it. Anyways, over the next few years, he grew immensely, partially fueled by another outrageous claim that he made in 2002. Jose Luis, aka Paul the Apostle, became bored of being Paul the Apostle. He had another revelation that he was actually the next phase of Jesus Christ on earth. Instead of saying that he was the second coming of Christ, he labeled himself as Jesus Christ Man, which I absolutely love. That is so funny. Like, imagine doing that and being serious about it. And you know what? Funnily enough, that name wouldn't stick around for too long, because in 2006, Jose Luis, aka Paul the Apostle, aka Jesus Christ Man, decided that his new moniker would be the Antichrist. Yes, the Antichrist. But what was interesting, his labeling was that he did not mean the devil. What he meant by the Antichrist was that Christians no longer needed to follow the, quote, Jewish teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, but instead should be following the teachings of Paul the Apostle. And his ever so loyal followers showed their support by getting 666 tattoos. Now again, the number 666 is a number commonly associated with the devil and demonic practices. But Jose Luis insisted that the devil was defeated a long time ago, and to him and his followers, the number 666 represented the number of wisdom, and those who displayed it truly showed that they were followers of Jesus, which is just wildly contradictory to what he was teaching, by the way. His members would get it tattooed all over. Some got it tattooed on their arms, some got it tattooed on their forehead, and you know, there was one case where a family held down their 3-year-old child and got it tattooed on them as well. Towards the end of his life, Jose Luis made some pretty extreme claims that all centered around the year 2012. One of the most notable being the idea of the Transformation Day. He claimed that sometime between June 30th and July 1st, 2012, he and his followers would receive a transformation into a fully enlightened and heavenly body. This transformation would allow them to basically have superpowers like walking through walls and being able to walk through fire without getting burned. Shockingly, this did not occur, along with many other of his predictions, which were causing his following to drastically decline. But that ultimately didn't matter because the church disbanded a year later after following Jose Luis's passing in 2013. Santo Daime is a Brazilian religious movement that was originally founded in the 1930s. The group has a unique spiritual belief of blending aspects of Christianity, Afro-Brazilian beliefs, and Amazonian spirituality, but the beliefs are fundamentally Christian at their core. The group reveres Jesus Christ and his mother Mary above all else. Most of the original practitioners were illiterate, so unlike many other Christian-derived religions, there is not a focus on the written text. Rather, the main focus of the group is based in experiential rituals that are centered around group-sung hymns and their holy sacrament, Daime, otherwise known as the hallucinogenic psychedelic ayahuasca. To Santo Daime, ayahuasca is sometimes referred to as the blood of Jesus, and by consuming it and performing these ritualistic chants, they are able to be guided by the divine will of God through spiritual visions. The reason this religion raises a few eyebrows is because it's sort of decentralized. There isn't one large organization that makes all the rules or controls all the sub-branches. Even though it is a recognized state religion and a religious movement, there isn't like a pope, so to say. So this leads to a sort of issue where there can be an extreme abuse of power within this faith. Now, I'll preface here and say that not all members or spirit leaders are bad in this group. In fact, it seems that many of them are just rich people who want to legally do drugs in the jungle. But there are sort of these splinter groups that have fallen into the issue of having a hyper-charismatic leader who runs a commune in a remote cut-off part of the jungle who can allegedly guide people to enlightenment through the use of extremely potent psychedelic substances. I think you can see where this might be a problem. Depending where one goes to partake in the ceremonies, they may find themselves in a very isolated community where people don't question the leader at all, and those participating in the sacrament are generally in a very vulnerable state of mind due to the substances they are taking, which leaves them to be very suggestible. But for the most part, they don't meet that high demand group label. There's no persecution of those who leave, no major hierarchical structure, and its beliefs are pretty publicly known. The cult allegations simply come from a handful of rather extreme groups, since the movement, like I said, is pretty decentralized. While researching this video, I saw quite a few people on Reddit discussing the spread of evangelist Christianity throughout Central and South America, and many of them referred to these churches as a cult. Kind of like Luz del Mundo, they have an extremely strong singular authority figure who kind of controls the church. But the thing about these is that they're not all like that. Now, definitely many are, and there certainly seems to be a lot of them popping up all over the region, which has caused a lot of people to get concerned. What's weird about these churches is, though they are a very large branch and they all share similar beliefs, a lot of these newer churches that pop up are like technically decentralized. The cult aspect is that the respective preacher and founder of the church is usually will have some sort of claim to divine truth that was revealed to just them directly, and they have pretty strict power structures, and oftentimes the preachers are using fear tactics to get more people to follow and listen to them. The concern is that even though they are essentially disconnected from each other, each one of these churches could potentially grow and become a much larger problem if their preacher is like a good enough cult leader to do so. So it's kind of like watching 100 baby cults get born. Even if just one gets big, it's going to be a problem down the line. Another thing I saw was the concept of the folk saint cult, but cult doesn't really apply to these groups or their beliefs. Around a lot of Mexico in particular, there are localized saints that have huge followings in public worship. Some, like Santa Muerte, who is a depiction of death, are nationwide and have been associated with crime groups that use its symbolism, and there's smaller cult offshoots that use their symbolism too, but as a whole, it's just a localized form of worship. And all of these folk saint groups don't explicitly just worship the saint either. It's more like they just play a huge role in their local religious practices. And I'd also like to briefly mention Inre Cristo. This is a Brazilian guy who claims to be Jesus, but what's funny about him is that he's always dressed like Jesus, and he goes on TV like all the time. And he does have his followers, but from what I saw, it kind of just seems like this weird LARP that he's doing. Anyways, that's kind of what I wrote for today. Some things I noticed were that a majority of the cults I researched, both ones I talked and didn't talk about, were all offshoots of Christianity. And at first I was like, that's weird. But then it made sense seeing that this is like the most Christian region of the world. There are other churches and high demand groups from the region, but the ones I covered I found to be the most cult-like. Anyways, thank you for watching. What's your favorite Latin American cult? If you're still here, consider liking and subscribing if you haven't already. Thank you to my Patreon producers for sponsoring me again, and have a good day.